The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you.
So tonight we're fortunate to have both Jonathan Mahler and Neal Katyal with us to discuss Jonathan Mahler's latest book, The Challenge, Hamdan v. Rumsfeld and the Fight Over Presidential Power. The book chronicles the defense of Salam Hamdan by military defense lawyer Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift and Georgetown constitutional law scholar Neal Katyal. Together, they sued the President of the United States on behalf of Hamdan, an accused terrorist, in order to prevent the American government from breaking the law and violating the Constitution. In the spring of 2006, Katyal argued the case Hamdan v. Rumsfeld before the Supreme Court and won. Mahler wrote Hamdan v. Rumsfeld with the cooperation of Swift and Katyal in addition to extensive interviews in Yemen and Guantanamo Bay. He is a writer for the New York Times Magazine and is the author of Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning. Both books are available for purchase after the talk outside. We'll first hear from Jonathan Mahler, and following his talk, both of our participants will be answering questions and have an interactive discussion. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Mahler.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm going to just sort of talk a little bit about the book. I'm going to read a little bit from the book to give you some sort of flavor of the book. We're lucky that one of the two main characters of the book is here tonight, Neal Katyal, who will probably say a few words when I'm done, and then we're happy to take questions of any sort. The book began really with a magazine story that I wrote back in 2004. I'm a writer for the New York Times Magazine by day, and the article was a profile of a Navy JAG, a Navy lawyer by the name of Charlie Swift, Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift. And I had been sent down to Washington to profile Swift because he had just been appointed to a new office inside the Pentagon, the Office of Military Commissions. And this office had been created because in the aftermath of 9/11, the president had sort of authorized the creation of military tribunals, the country's first military tribunals in more than 50 years, in which selected suspected terrorists who were captured in the War on Terror would be tried. And Swift was one of a very, very small group of military lawyers who'd been chosen to actually serve as a defense lawyer in these military tribunals. So the operating assumption at the time among many people, and certainly inside the government, was that as a Navy lawyer, as a Navy officer, as Swift was, he would basically roll over and do whatever the government wanted him to do. Which in this case was actually to encourage his client, Salam Hamdan, who I'll tell you more about a little bit later, to encourage Hamdan to plead guilty. But as I spent a little time with Swift down in Washington, it very quickly became apparent that was not at all what Swift intended to do. In fact, what Swift was planning to do was not only defend Hamdan on the facts of the case, on the merits of the case, which is to say, argue that Hamdan was innocent, that he was basically a civilian. Hamdan himself was a driver for bin Laden, and Swift was going to argue that he was really a civilian employee for bin Laden, that he had not participated in any of the Al-Qaeda conspiracies or certainly in any of the attacks, and that in fact he really had very little idea what was going on inside the organization. But Swift was not only planning to argue his innocence, he was planning to sue the Bush administration on behalf of this guy, arguing that this very trial system in which he was to be prosecuted was illegal. And to do that, Swift had brought aboard Neal Katyal, a constitutional law professor at Georgetown. So needless to say, it was it sort of came as a big surprise to everyone that these were Swift's plans. And my story was published back in the spring of 2004, and the headline was "Commander Swift Objects," which sort of gives you some sense of the thrust of the story. And at that point, I sort of realized that I was at the beginning of an interesting story, and that I wanted to kind of follow it from there, which is what I did. And the story sort of, in a sense, kind of became two different stories. One was the story of Swift and his client, Salam Hamdan, and their relationship, their extraordinary relationship. And I'll give you a little sense of Hamdan. I was not allowed to interview Hamdan personally because journalists are not allowed to speak with the detainees on Guantanamo Bay. So I was only able to kind of catch him visually in glimpses in the courtroom down there. Sort of to assemble my portrait of him, I had to rely on the lawyers, the translator, and I went to Yemen for a couple weeks and spent time with Hamdan's family and friends, and got a chance to kind of see the world that he had come from. And that world was basically, well, his story begins in a small tribal village in southeastern Yemen called the Hadramaut, where he was born in the late 1960s. And he was born to a very poor family. And both of his parents died at a very young age, when he was at a very young age, so he was orphaned at an early age, was uneducated, had the rough equivalent of a fourth grade education. And after his parents died, he sort of drifted around Yemen for a number of years before eventually, at the age of around 20, making his way to the capital city of Yemen, Sana'a. And he hoped that in Sana'a he might be able to find employment and maybe kind of find a purpose to his life. But as it turned out, the unemployment in Yemen is extraordinarily high, and he didn't have any education to speak of, any skills to speak of, aside from his ability to drive and fix cars. So he became essentially a part-time taxi driver. He lived in a boarding house on a mattress in a crowded boarding house, and he spent whatever income he had on a narcotic plant that everyone in Yemen chews called khat. So that was Hamdan's life, more or less, when he met a man in 1996 who was putting together a group of jihadis to go to go fight in Tajikistan, in fact, and this notion of jihad was certainly on some level appealing to Hamdan, for a man who really had no purpose to his life, who was told that this was something. This was something meaningful, and it was a job. It was something to do. His travel would be paid for. He'd be given a salary. So he joined this group of jihadis, and they met up in Afghanistan, started making their way to the border of Tajikistan, but they were unable to get through, so unable to get into Tajikistan after many months of traveling. So they were kind of casting around, trying to figure out what to do, and one of the jihadis suggested that they go see a man, a sheikh, who had just set up shop in Afghanistan by the name of Osama bin Laden. Now, as I mentioned, this was back in 1996, before bin Laden became the international celebrity that he is today. But Hamdan and this group of jihadis made their way to bin Laden. And bin Laden preached to them about sort of joining him and remaining with him and staying on and working for him. And Hamdan did so, and he stayed there for 5 years until the aftermath of 9/11, when he was picked up near the border of Pakistan in November of 2001. He spent about 6 months in Afghanistan before being sent to Guantanamo Bay, and was on Guantanamo Bay for quite some time, and quite a bit of that time also in solitary confinement, before a man walked into his cell in a military uniform and introduced himself as Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift, and said he was there to defend him. So I'm now going to read the passage from the book, in which I kind of tell the story of the first meeting between Swift and Hamdan. And just to give you a little more background, this was Hamdan had at this point been in U.S. custody for a couple of years. He'd been interrogated literally dozens of times. We don't know exactly how many times because his CIA interrogations are not public. But he'd been interrogated certainly dozens of times by men in military uniforms. And now, after spending a couple of months in solitary confinement, a man in a military uniform is about to walk into his cell and say, "Oh no, I'm the guy you can actually trust." So Swift certainly had his work cut out for him, particularly because in his when he was appointed to represent Hamdan, the government told him that he could go down and meet with Hamdan, of course, for the purpose of negotiating a guilty plea. So it was really the government's assumption that that's what Swift intended to do, to encourage Hamdan to plead guilty. Of course, that isn't what Swift wanted to do, but he was concerned that this would potentially be his first and last meeting with his client, that after the government learned that he was actually going to fight and protest his innocence, that he might be cut off from his client. So he certainly had his work cut out for him. He also had brought along a translator, a guy named Chuck Schmitz, who also figures as something of important character in the story because Schmitz remained Swift's translator for Hamdan over the years, and in a sense was the one who really knew Hamdan best, as he's the one who was able to kind of communicate directly with him. So that's a little bit of the background, and I'll read that passage to you now. Guantanamo Bay Naval Base is divided into two areas, windward and leeward, by the 2.5-mile wide bay for which it is named. The airport is on the leeward side. Nearly everything else is a short ferry ride away on the windward side. There are housing subdivisions, a few fast food restaurants, a strip mall, a bowling alley, a drive-in movie theater, and a neglected 9-hole golf course. The overall effect is small-town America, if a sad and somewhat dated version of it. The whole base is about 45 square miles, or roughly the size of the island of Manhattan. After disembarking from the ferry, Swift and Schmitz made their way to the headquarters of the joint task force that runs the base. They happened to arrive in the midst of a drill to prepare for a terrorist attack. Roadblocks had been erected everywhere, and the female soldier charged with preparing their access badges was made up to look like a casualty. Theatrics that were hardly necessary to make this place one of the strangest either of them had ever been. Swift soon found his footing, though. Asked to sign a statement ensuring that he wouldn't say anything to the media about what they saw in Guantanamo, he insisted on amending the language to read that he wouldn't say anything, quote, in violation of the National Security Act. That evening, he and Schmitz went to the Marine Galley, which Swift had been told had decent food and a great view. It was surf and turf night, so they ate steak and lobster, followed by Ben & Jerry's Peace Pops, as they watched the sun drop down below the bay. 36 hours later, they set out for Camp Delta in a rusty red van to meet Hamdan. From a distance, Swift could make out the plywood guard towers draped in American flags, and as they drew closer, the heavy chain-link fencing topped with concertina wire that ringed the camp. A 4-by-8-foot sign hung from the main entrance to Delta, "Honor bound to defend freedom," the motto for the Joint Task Force Guantanamo. Swift wore a khaki uniform rather than his dress whites because he wanted to seem as accessible as possible. At the entrance gate, he declined to place a strip of black tape over his name tag, the custom among most soldiers and officers, who prefer to keep their identities hidden from the suspected terrorists inside. For the past several weeks, ever since the president had designated him for trial by military commission, Hamdan had been in solitary confinement, or as the Defense Department called it, pre-commission confinement, in a separate area inside Delta known as Camp Echo. The administration didn't want the other detainees to know that he'd been assigned a lawyer, or worse, give him the chance to report to the rest of the prison population on the substance of their conversations. Swift and Schmitz were led down a long dirt path toward a cluster of 8 cinder block huts with corrugated tin roofs that faced inward on a square. It hadn't rained on Guantanamo in weeks, and they kicked up small clouds of dust as they walked. The guards unlocked the door to Echo 3, and Swift got his first look at Hamdan, a small, frail-looking man, 5 feet 6 inches, 130 pounds, he estimated, in a baggy orange jumpsuit. He had a shaved head and a long beard, and he was smiling. As Swift would later learn, Hamdan always smiled when he was nervous. The hut was divided in two by a heavy metal grate. On one side was a metal bed and stainless steel toilet. On the other were two abutting folding tables and 3 white plastic chairs. Solemn Hamdan sat at the opposite end of the tables beneath a bank of bright fluorescent lights. His hands and feet were bound to a chain around his waist, his ankles fastened to an eye bolt in the floor. An old air conditioning unit labored noisily against the stifling heat. "I want him released from those chains," Swift said. "We can't do that," one of the guards answered. After some debate, they agreed to at least unchain his hands. They asked Swift if he wanted one of them to remain in the cell, and Swift said no. They showed him the red panic button marked duress on the wall and left him alone with his client. "I'm a military attorney, and I've been appointed to represent you," Swift began. "I can understand if you don't trust me right now. I work for the same people who are holding you here." He proceeded to detail his educational background and military rank, which an Arab culture expert had told Swift would impress Hamdan. They didn't seem to. Hamdan was polite but curt, insisting on a civilian lawyer. He wasn't any happier with Schmitz. He wanted an Arab translator. Swift asked for a chance to earn his trust. Whether Hamdan really believed that Swift was his lawyer, or more likely, just another interrogator, he was eager to rant about his mistreatment at the hands of the Americans. He told Swift that during his first several weeks in Bagram, he had been stashed away in a dark cell in the basement of the prison when representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross came through. Swift scribbled furiously onto a yellow legal pad as Hamdan spoke. About an hour into their 2.5-hour meeting, Swift told Hamdan about the government's offer: 20 years for a guilty plea and full cooperation. "What do they say I've done?" Hamdan asked. "They haven't charged you yet," Swift answered. "They sent me here to negotiate a guilty plea." "How can I plead guilty if I don't know what I've done?" Hamdan asked. After a long pause, Hamdan asked Swift if he thought he should take the deal. Swift gave him his advice. "These military commissions are presidential policy, and sooner or later the president is going to change. A different president may want to pursue a different foreign policy. If you plead guilty to something, no president is going to argue for your release. On the other hand, if you plead not guilty, there's a very real possibility that someone in the future may release you." Swift then outlined for Hamdan the alternative to a guilty plea. He listed some of the rights under the Geneva Conventions and the Uniform Code of Military Justice that he believed Hamdan was entitled to, but had thus far been denied. It was unclear how much, if anything, Hamdan was grasping, yet Swift pressed on. "The only way to get you these rights is to sue the Bush administration," he said. "That's what I'd like to do. Sue President Bush." Another long pause followed. "This lawsuit, will it make you rich?" Hamdan finally asked. "No," Swift answered, "but it might make me famous." Then he added, "It might make you famous, too." "I don't want to be famous," Hamdan replied. "I just want to get out of here." That night, Swift and Schmitz watched the Super Bowl on Armed Forces television, and the following day they returned to Camp Echo. At the end of the meeting, Swift told Hamdan they'd be back soon, and encouraged him to think about the government's offer in the interim. "Do you believe we're here to help you?" Swift asked, standing up to leave. "A drowning man will grab onto any hand that's extended to him," Hamdan replied. So thus begins this extraordinary relationship between Swift and Hamdan that I chronicle in the book, and to give you some sense of how extraordinary it was, Swift visited Hamdan literally every month for several days, and he found a man who was spent much of that time in solitary confinement, was really losing control of his mental faculties, was losing his mind, and really had no contact with anyone else. So he took his frustrations and his anger at his mistreatment out on his lawyer, of course, Swift. And it's not an overstatement really to say that Swift, it was really Swift's job to keep Hamdan alive down there. He went on numerous hunger strikes, one of which resulted in him being force-fed in a restraining chair through a feeding tube inserted into his throat, and he fired Swift repeatedly. Yet each time Swift would dutifully return to Guantanamo Bay and try to meet with Hamdan. Sometimes Hamdan would send out a note saying that he was not willing to meet with him, but Swift would persevere, and over the years, and it really was a matter of years, they really built an intense relationship, and I chronicle that relationship in the book. Now that's sort of one kind of part of the book, and the other part of the book is really the story of the legal case itself, the case Hamdan v. Rumsfeld, and the case was led. The architect of the case is here with us, Neal Katyal, and in sort of simple terms, what they were arguing was to begin with that these military tribunals were illegal because the president had unilaterally authorized them in the aftermath of 9/11, that he had not gone to Congress, the body that's charged with writing the laws, so that he had, in so doing, violated the separation of powers. So that was sort of the overriding claim in their lawsuit. But additionally, they argued that the trials themselves, which is to say this trial system that the administration had unilaterally authorized and written and created, which is to say that the Pentagon wrote the rules for the trials, and the Pentagon decided who would be tried and on what charges, and they wrote these charges after the defendants were already in custody. That the rules for the trials failed to comport with guarantees provided by the Geneva Conventions and the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the U.S. law that governs military law, essentially. So the lawsuit began in 2004 as well, and just as I was starting the book, in fact, and to give you some sense of what a long shot it was back then, at the time, the Bush administration was arguing, and really to great success in the federal courts, that Guantanamo detainees didn't even have the right to bring a lawsuit in federal court, that the federal judges didn't have the power to hear a claim from a detainee on Guantanamo Bay. And this was the Bush administration's argument, and they virtually every time a detainee had tried to bring a lawsuit to challenge their detention in federal court, the Bush administration lawyers had made that argument, and they'd won. So it seemed very unlikely that they would even get a hearing in federal court. But lo and behold, shortly after, several months after their lawsuit was filed, the Supreme Court heard the first, or decided the first case in the War on Terror, and in the first of what would become really a string of significant decisions in the War on Terror, which to many of us have sort of blended together. There have been so many now, but each one of them is enormously significant in its own right. And this one, the Rasool decision, basically said that the courts were open to the Guantanamo detainees, that the government could not prevent these guys from getting a hearing in federal court. So with that, their lawsuit was able to proceed. And what was happening really was the government was trying to push ahead with its military tribunal. They were trying to try Hamdan in what Katyal and Swift were arguing was an unfair trial. They wanted to get this tribunal going, and the lawyers, Swift and Katyal, wanted to prevent it with their federal lawsuit. So essentially, there was sort of a race going on, and down on Guantanamo in the fall of 2004, they just weeks after they'd made their first argument in federal court in Washington D.C., the military tribunal got underway. And Swift got up and made these were the pretrial hearings, and Swift got up and made their first argument, and I was down there at the time, and an MP walks in and hands a yellow sticky note to the military judge presiding over the military trial, and he bangs his gavel and adjourns the hearing, and no one has any idea what's going on. People think that maybe there's been a terrorist attack, or at least a threat of a terrorist attack, but as it turns out, what had happened was that the federal judge, who had heard their argument just weeks before, had told the president that he can't go ahead with these tribunals, that they were unlawful. And from there, the lawsuit basically made its way through the federal system. They lost at the Court of Appeals, and then petitioned the Supreme Court to hear the case. And if the odds were long against them, even sort of getting any traction in the federal courts, the odds of getting a hearing at the Supreme Court were extraordinarily long. just based on the numbers alone, the Supreme Court gets something like 8,000 petitions a year for about the 100 cases it hears. So it seemed unlikely just on that level alone. But the Supreme Court has historically been especially wary of hearing cases that deal with the president's wartime power, because they don't want to be in a position of having to tell the president he can't do something that he thinks is necessary to keep the country safe. But they did get their petition heard. And much to a lot of people's surprise, and after a lot of delay from the court, a lot of deliberation among the justices about whether or not they should hear it, and Katyal argued it, and I'm now going to read you one final passage, which is the passage of the day of the argument. But before I do that, I'm going to give you a little more background about Neal arguing the case, and that is that many people thought that it was a big mistake for him to argue the case, and that is because he was an inexperienced trial lawyer. He had while he had been a clerk on the Supreme Court, he'd obviously never argued at the Supreme Court, and in fact he'd really only argued a few cases in his life, one of which was a speeding ticket, and one of which was a landlord-tenant dispute. So it's not surprising that a lot of people felt that it was a mistake that a case of this magnitude, challenging the commander-in-chief's wartime power, should be argued by someone who had so little courtroom experience. But Neal was determined to argue the case, and he had spent now years immersed in this subject. He felt that he knew it better than anyone, and he also felt he recognized that there were a lot of arguments against him actually making the argument before the justices. So he felt that the only way to really to do it right and to keep the argument was to just prepare obsessively. And that's what he did for months. He began by taking out a legal pad and writing down the names of all the lawyers and law professors around the country who most intimidated him. And he called each and every one of them up and asked them to moot him, to grill him. And he flew all over the country and had moot courts with all of these various lawyers and law professors. And he also kept a copy of the case record, hundreds of pages next to on a table next to his bed at night, and studied them before he went to sleep, so that he could commit the entire case record to memory, hundreds and hundreds of pages, because he wanted to, if asked by a justice where to find this or that in the record, he wanted to be able to refer not just to the page number, but to the specific paragraph on that page. And as it turned out, that in fact did happen in the argument. Justice Stevens asked him where to find something, and he pointed him to the very spot on the very page where it was. So he did all that, and he also recognized that he needed to work on his courtroom presence, that he needed to be a little more relaxed in the courtroom. So he agreed to work with a touchy-feely trial consultant who had been a kind of part-time sitcom actor, whose advice for Neal included lining up his children's stuffed animals and practicing making eye contact with them as though they were the Supreme Court justices. And he also insisted that Neal sing in the shower on the morning of the argument, because he felt that otherwise, when he was standing before the justices, he might be self-conscious about hearing the sound of his own voice. But if he were to sing in the shower, he'd already be familiar with the sound of his own voice. It wouldn't sound unusual to him. So as you can imagine, the months that Neal spent preparing for this argument, it was months, obsessively around the clock. And I've only mentioned a few of the things he did, just really the beginning of a long laundry list of obsessive-compulsive behavior. But the argument, the day of the argument arrived, and I'm just going to read you the passage where he arrives at the courthouse on the day of the argument, and then I'll finish up from there. March 28th, 2006 dawned clear and brisk in Washington. Katyal awoke early, having slept better than he expected. He felt less anxious than he'd felt in a while. In 6 hours, win or lose, it would all be over. He put on a dark gray suit and tie that his mother had given him for the occasion and stashed his father's wristwatch in his pocket for good luck. Katyal had received some threatening voicemail messages over the past few weeks and had hired 2 bodyguards for the day. They picked him up at a little after 8 and drove him to the Supreme Court in his minivan while he listened to music on his iPod. The Supreme Court's tradition of humility and restraint appears to have been the last thing on the mind of the courthouse's architects. An early occupant, Justice Harlan Fiske Stone, once described the Supreme Court building as, quote, almost bombastically pretentious. One of Stone's colleagues suggested that the only way he and his brethren could live up to the pomp of their surroundings would be to enter the courthouse on elephants. As one of the day's advocates, Katyal had been asked to enter through a side door, but he wanted to use the main entrance instead. Somewhat counterintuitively, he felt that absorbing the full grandiosity of the setting, the long marble staircase, the 16 Corinthian columns, the words equal justice under law etched into the stone below the pediment, would have a calming effect, putting things in perspective for him. Whatever the stakes of Hamdan, he was still just one lawyer arguing one case in the long history of this great institution. By the time Katyal arrived, the plaza facing the courthouse was flooded with people, dozens of whom had spent the whole night in line waiting for tickets. Electronic devices were not permitted inside the Supreme Court, so he left his iPod and BlackBerry inside the marshal's office. It was 8:45 a.m., roughly 2 hours before Hamdan, the second argument of the day, would be heard. The interior of the Supreme Court building, with its soaring ceilings, ornate friezes, bronze busts, and still more marble columns, is no less imposing than the building's exterior. But Katyal felt at home there. He still knew some of the security guards, and behind the counter in the cafeteria was a woman who had often made him breakfast during his clerkship. She gave him a hug and wished him luck. Arguing advocates may request a card that entitles them to roam certain parts of the Supreme Court building not open to the public. Tom Goldstein, who was one of Neal's advisors for the Supreme Court argument, had suggested to Katyal that he procure one and hole up in the law library to relax and gather his thoughts before the argument. Katyal had planned to do this, but was overtaken by an irrational fear that he might get stuck in the library, which was upstairs, and miss his argument. So when he finished eating his bagel and cream cheese, he instead did the one thing that Goldstein had urged him not to do. He went into the courtroom and listened to the argument preceding Hamdan. The lawyer at the podium, who looked to be even younger than Katyal, parried complicated questions from the bench with ease and grace, thrusting Katyal into a fresh spiral of self-doubt. Why didn't I give the argument away? I can't answer any of these questions. Then it dawned on him that he wouldn't have to. This wasn't Hamdan. It was a health insurance case that turned on an especially obscure subsection of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. Katyal left the courtroom at 10:35, 25 minutes before his argument was to begin. He had not sung in the shower in the morning because he hadn't wanted to wake up Joanna, who was going to be coming to the courthouse later with his mother and sister. So he went into a stall in the bathroom of the lawyer's lounge and belted out the theme song from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He returned to the courtroom. Chief Justice Roberts closed the prior argument. The case is submitted, rose from his black leather chair, and walked off the bench, leaving the ensuing proceedings in the hands of the court's senior-most justice, John Paul Stevens. We'll hear argument in 05-184, Hamdan against Rumsfeld, Justice Stevens said at 11:01. Mr. Katyal, you may proceed. The lawyer who had preceded Katyal was still clearing his pages as Katyal moved to the podium. He brought with him a white binder with one sheet of paper attached to the front and another attached to the back. One sheet contained his opening statement, the other a page of typewritten notes. Taped to the side of the page of notes was a blank check, a reminder to use the resonant phrase that Justice O'Connor had penned in an opinion in 2004. A state of war is not a blank check for the president. All 500 of the courtroom seats were occupied. Moments before the argument started, Swift overheard a brief exchange directly behind him between an unlikely pair. The Pentagon's advisor for the military commissions, General Hemingway, and a human rights lawyer who was working with some of the Guantanamo detainees. They agreed that Katyal was in for a long morning. Katyal was now at the podium. Standing before the justices, he was struck by the intimacy of the setting. He took a moment to compose himself, to think about his family and make eye contact with each of the justices, and began, "Justice Stevens, and may it please the court." So from there, of course, Neal delivers the argument, and it was more or less kind of instantly recognized as one of the sort of the great arguments in recent years on the court. But at that point, all they could do was sort of wait and see what was going to happen. And the Supreme Court is obviously a very old-fashioned institute, and they don't release their decisions on the internet. They don't even tell you when the decisions are going to be coming down. So if you're someone with a stake in the case, or someone who's just interested in knowing what's going to happen in a certain case, and you want to be there when the news breaks, you have to go to the courtroom. And that's what Neal and Charlie Swift did. They went day in and day out for weeks. They would meet outside the courthouse and walk in and take their seats and watch the justices file in, and the justices would take their seats, and then they would proceed to announce the two cases that they had decided. And day after day, it was not the Hamdan case. And it wasn't, in fact, until the very last day of the Supreme Court's term that they handed down their decision in Hamdan. And it was a sweeping victory for Swift and Katyal, and for Hamdan himself in particular. And the decision went really well beyond anything they had realistically expected, because not only had the majority of the justices declared these military tribunals illegal, they had gone a step further, and they had come to the conclusion that the president, even during times of war, must abide by the laws and treaties of the United States. Now, this may sound somewhat self-evident, but actually, many of the Bush administration's policies in the war on terror were built on the assumption that the president could circumvent these laws and treaties during the time of war. So, not surprisingly, the Hamdan decision set off a panic inside the Bush administration, because suddenly policies such as the ghost prisons in foreign countries where suspected terrorists were rendered and often tortured, that was now illegal. The warrantless wiretapping program, the secret terrorist surveillance program, that was now illegal. So it was a huge decision, and not least of all, it forced Congress to get involved in the shape of these military tribunals, and basically over the course of the summer of 2006, Congress and the president kind of went back and forth, and Congress eventually passed what is known as the Military Commissions Act, which authorized these military tribunals. And a lot of people still feel that the rules are unfair, that these guys are not getting a fair trial. But nevertheless, the trials went forward, and Hamdan was tried just this summer, finally, after all those years. And there were two charges brought against him. Conspiracy and material support for terrorism. Conspiracy was by far the more serious charge, but he was acquitted on the conspiracy charge. He was convicted on the material support for terrorism charge, and now it came time for the government to sentence him, and or rather for the military judge to sentence him, the military jury to sentence him, and the government was asking that he be sentenced to 30 years to life, and as it turned out, the jury sentenced him to, after time served, which is to say all the years he'd already spent on Guantanamo, about an additional 5 months. So I'll leave it there. The one last comment I'll make is there's been a lot of criticism, much of it justifiable, of the Bush administration's policies in the war on terror, and how our sort of treatment of detainees has sort of sullied America's international image and all the damage that's been done. And as I said, much of this is certainly justified criticism. But that's not what this book is about. And in a sense, it's not what the Hamdan story is about. And in fact, it's on the contrary. To me, this book and this story is really kind of about the greatness of this country and the fact that during a time of war, a group of lawyers, one of whom is the child of immigrants, one of whom is a military officer, could bring a lawsuit, could bring a challenge to the President of the United States, have that challenge heard, have that case heard, win at the highest court in the land, the most powerful court in the country, and in so doing really change the course of history, is to me a great testament to the resilience of our values and the resilience of our Constitution, and is something we can all be proud of. And I think it's nice to have something we can all be proud of at this point. So I will leave it at that, and I think Neal may have a few things to say, and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.